So what I'll do is I'm going to give it like a 10-minute kind of overview of work that I'm doing at the moment in the east of England. I'm going to frame it in the hostile environment of Theresa May, and I'm going to maybe ask some questions about the role of borders in relation to quite embedded and close work in particular places, and these kind of places that I'll talk about, and then I'll hand over to Anita. Anita's one of the people that I've been working with in one area, Wisbech. Anita's doing absolutely fantastic work, so you'll hear more about that a bit after me. And I'm just going to open things up, and we'll kind of see where we go. In terms of questions, feel free to put things in the chat, and I think we'll have a really good discussion at the end. I'm going to get my slides up. Hopefully you can see this. Right, so what I'm going to do, I'm hopefully not going to say too many things that you've heard before, but I wanted to kind of begin us in a kind of place really in terms of thinking about the hostile environment and where that comes from, and really where I'm going with this, by kind of bringing in Theresa May and those awful vans with the kind of go home messages on them, is to think really about the kind of consequences in different parts of England of a hostile environment policy and how that affects different migrant workers. And so I'll kind of set out the hostile environment. I'm going to tell you about my project. And then towards the end, I'm going to get us to reflect on a couple of interesting points that have come up about borders, migration, and attitudes to Englishness that come up in some of the interviews that I've been doing over the last few weeks and months. And here is the hostile environment line, Theresa May, 2012, in an interview. The aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal migration. What we don't want is a situation where people think that they can come here and overstay
I see that Dan is having some
because
issues.
they're able to access everything they need. Now, of course, this is about illegal migration, but the last one, the environment that's created for legal migrant workers. And maybe underpinning this, and I'm not going to put it in my words, I'm going to put it in one of my interviews words, the legacy of attitudes around colonialism in the British Empire. This is something that Kathryn's really unpack really insightful way later. But how does kind of play out in terms of
Is it just my internet, or is Dan freezing as well?
No, Dan's Dan's frozen. Dan,
different people's attitudes to
Dan? I think you have some internet issues.
Yeah, it's frozen again on mine.
Yeah.
I wonder if turning the camera off might help.
Yeah, maybe I've connected to a different Wi-Fi source here. Has that made any difference or not really?
We can hear you better now, but I think we've lost you after 1 or 2 minutes since you
I think
started.
you should turn your camera off, and we'll see if that helps.
Could you start from the beginning?
Yeah, okay.
If that's okay for you?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so
yeah,
sorry.
okay, yeah. I'm
We
so
hear you much
sorry.
better.
I thought, yeah,
Thank
I
you.
thought,
Yeah, that's better.
yeah, sorry, I thought, yeah, I'm not we're at a kind of work retreat at the moment. So, okay, right, no camera. I'll do that. I'll do that bit again, right, a little more quickly. So, right, where was I? Let's just assume
We
that
have
you
time,
missed-
Dan. You can
missed all of
take
it.
the time that you wanted. It's okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Okay. Well, I'll kind of cut to the chase a little bit more quickly. So, what I want to do in this talk is set out the work that I've been doing in the east of England, thinking about the ways in which hostile environment policies and attitudes to borders impact not just migrant workers in one part of England, but also the ways in which our attitudes to migration and work sometimes overlap and become entangled with ideas of Englishness, Britishness, ideas of class. And what I've got here to kind of get started these reflections, and I'll tell you more about my work, is Theresa May set her kind of words around the hostile environment policy. This is from an interview that she gave in 2012, where she says the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal migration. What we don't want is a situation where people think that they can come here and overstay because they're able to access everything they need. And what I want to do in this kind of short talk, by kind of returning to this hostile environment language and message, which, has become government policy and government agenda over the last 12 years, is to not just think about the impact of borders in terms of illegal migration, but also of legal migration too. And maybe to kind of ask more kind of probing questions about what the UK expects and how it views migration, migrants, good migrants and bad migrants, and how that overlaps with some of the often most exploitative sectors of UK work. And the project I'll be talking about is in the east of England. It's where you have a lot of agricultural work and work in food factories, or kind of factories processing, like flowers, cut flowers that we give on Mother's Day, to kind of think about some of these questions. So what I've got here now, and again, shout if something gets stuck, is these YouGov do regular polls of voters every couple of weeks. This is about 5,000 people, and they're asked, what do you think is the most pressing issue, for the UK? And what you can see in the purple line, if you kind of look across it from left to right, you'll see it kind of really spikes in the middle in early 2016. This purple line represents.
Sorry, Taylor, we can't see your screen. Your screen is not shared. I'm not sure whether you want to show us something from your presentation, because when you turned off the camera, your screen also disappeared.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
Could you please share your screen again? I thought you were going without the presentation at all. Sorry.
No, I've got. My team says I'm sharing screen. It's still. Can you see anything now? Not really.
Can see you now.
We can see you, but not the presentation.
Not the screen. Okay. All right. Well, I'll just talk it. Yeah, we'll just do it that way then. If it's just not working. Right. Well, I know. In which case, maybe I'll put my camera on. Just tell me if it kind of cuts out. So, what you'll have to kind of imagine in front of you is an image of how UK voters kind of point out the what they see as the most kind of pressing issue, kind of politically. And migration, in early 2016 was considered the most important issue for voters, and then it went down. And at the moment, it's around 40%. So 40% of the public think that migration is the most kind of worrying issue, facing the country. Higher ones are health and the economy at 45 and 49. And maybe what I want to draw it here, because we'll talk a little bit about the discussion around small boats, is migration kind of creeping up as an issue of kind of voter concern. Now, I'll tell you a bit about the work that I've been doing in the east of England in the Fens. So the Fens is the UK's food bowl, in a sense. It's where most of our vegetables grown, some fruit, especially fruit in the past, strawberries, apples. It's something that people kind of remember and are nostalgic about. If you're kind of there many times a year, you might see cabbages or potatoes growing. And when we think about the Fens, this is the east of England. It's a largely rural area. It's if you think where Cambridge is, it's just north of Cambridge. It includes Peterborough, arguably, or Peterborough's on the edge of the Fens. Places like Wisbech, Boston, Spalding, Kings Lynn, arguably, going up into North Cambridgeshire up to South Lincolnshire. So the work that I've been doing is focused in three parts of the Fens. So the market town of Wisbech, the market town of Boston, and the small city of Peterborough. And over the last, I think, 8-9 months, I've interviewed about 50 people, this kind of mixture of migrant workers and kind of British-born, UK-born people. I think a point to kind of say about the work in the Fens, or I suppose you're probably kind of wondering, why do you do this work in the east of England and not somewhere else? One of the things that makes the Fens really important, apart from the whole, growing our produce point or producing our food, is that as a part of the UK that's got some of the highest levels of migration, of having a non-UK born population. by some measures, it is one of the most cosmopolitan and diverse parts of the UK. But also what you've had there too in the past and even in the present is a kind of persistently high support for the Conservatives. In the past, this was, 8 years ago, a very high Brexit vote in Boston, had the highest Brexit vote, and to a lesser extent in Wisbech. So you've got places where there's been a lot of migration in the last 10 to 20 years from the east of Europe, from Portugal before that, where this is something that Anita works on, where you've got lots of migrants who've come to work on farms and in food factories, and the levels to which there's been integration or not integration, the levels to which communities have kind of come together, or there's been kind of an us and them mentality. So my work has been exploring that, doing interviews, doing focus groups. An underlying position that I've got is, we have this in the UK, an interest. You get this in terms of the AHRC as a funder. You get it in terms of ideas about regional inequalities and levelling up, in a focus in place and placemaking. Where I've been coming from in my work is thinking quite critically about what makes for living in a good place. I don't think it's just volunteers, doing litter picks. I think you need to think quite critically about the role of infrastructure, the role of connection and organisations that can kind of connect, and in what ways kind of connection works, the role of identity, and I think in a deeper kind of political economic way, the role of exploitation and work. So I'm looking at these questions. So over the last 6-9 months, I've been kind of doing work with, kind of starting to focus on different migrant experiences. And what I'll do here in the next couple of minutes is talk through some of the things that have come out, some of the recent interviews, and I'm going to use them to make some points about how the hostile environment is experienced by different migrant workers in the Fens. I'm going to give you a quote from Lexi, who's somebody that I interviewed at the Rosmini Centre, where Anita works. And when I was interviewing Lexi, we were talking about, her connection with England and English people, and her kind of the extent to which she'd felt welcomed by people in the kind of wider area, outside of just the Rosmini Centre. And she said, and this is a quote: "I guess there is no way, like for us, like for the foreigners, to be like," and she paused, "fully accepted. I don't know. There's always going to be something like the English. They're really good in kind of horses again, faking it." And I've kind of found this idea of this sense of when people have come to the UK, and kind of at first kind of surprised and impressed by the easy availability of factory jobs, bearing in mind that many in home countries, be it Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, may be very well qualified before kind of the availability of work in factories. But then kind of with that, this kind of sense, and this has come out in some of the interviews when we're going to talk about different interactions, where people that they've met and encountered might say, well, you've come here in order to better yourself, in this kind of condescending sense that you were not bettered before, or you should be grateful for the work that you've got. And we're going to dig into these attitudes a bit. One thing to note with agricultural work in the Fens is that before that kind of 10 to 20 year, before 10 years ago, 20 years ago, agricultural work was often organised by gangs, gang masters. This was a part of the country where you would have working class people from cities kind of coming and doing agricultural work. Many young people that grew up in Wisbech and Boston, people that have now been in their 50s and 60s, remember kind of working as children on their, on farms, not often their parents' farms, but farms that their parents also worked on, And what you also have in this area too is a kind of large like Romani traveller history as well, and travellers also worked on this land as well. So there's a kind of backdrop to thinking about an us and themness, a backdrop to thinking about exploitation. A thing to note too with places like Boston and Wisbech, and this has been part of the not the challenge, but the importance of kind of going around this work that I'm doing with a degree of slowness and care, is having people come in from the outside and looking down on people or feeling looked down on. And I'll give an example that Anita will know, and it's when Evan Davis, who we now know on BBC Radio, came to Wisbech and did a program called Life Swap, where he got this is about, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago. He went to Wisbech and worked with kind of unemployed English people, and you know, tried to get them to do the work of the migrants. And as the show kind of reveals in this kind of slightly comical, quite patronizing way, the English can't work as hard as the foreigners, you know, but at the same time they've got, you know, prejudiced attitudes. And again, it's implicit in the show, as well as being looked down upon, was this kind of message that, you know, the good and bad migrant, and the good migrant is the one that kind of works, you know, kind of selflessly and doesn't get involved in trade unions and doesn't kind of slow down and doesn't kind of fight back. And I think there's a lot of kind of complexity there. I'm going to give you a second quote from another interview. This is with a Portuguese worker who had worked for most of his life in the UK. He'd come in 2003 in different factories. This was in Boston. I'm going to call him Fernando. And I was asking him, we were talking about the conditions of factories and whether I asked him, you know, did he feel like he was kind of recognised for his work? It was a bit of a woolly question, and he kind of turned it on his head and he basically answered. He kind of turned it into, is he appreciated? And he said this, and here's the quote: No, they're not. And the dare is migrant workers. No, they're not. You treat them, so he's saying you, the English media, as in media interviewer, you treat them not the best way. Like, it's always faster, faster, faster. It's like, oh, you do 12-hour shift. You've not completed your job. Oh, I'm doing my 12 hours. No, you cannot go until we're done. I had shifts of 18 hours in the factory before. And then he said a little bit later, they can change the person every day because it's a lot of people with no job. And obviously, when we think about these conditions for migrants, there's a kind of a sense of a lack of solidarity, I suppose, with English people. There's often a lack of solidarity within migrant communities, within different national groups, but also that sense of being disposable. And I think that's been compounded by changes to settled status and the difficulties with getting visas now that, you know, migrant workers being increasingly exploited in the new environment that we're in. And Anita will talk about this in terms of her work with Flex. I'll give you one final quote, and this is from someone that I'll call Mahmoud. And he's very interesting. He'd also worked in factories, and he now owned a small business in Boston. And his kind of journey out of precarity and insecurity, I mean, again, I'm not quite sure how it come about, but he ended up becoming a small landlord. And I think there's a very interesting politics for landlordism in this area as well. And we were talking about attitudes to migrant work in his place of work, which I don't want to reveal too much more. And he very interesting, his background is North African. He kind of framed it in terms of the British Empire and colonialism. This is him, kind of a quote from an interview. And what shocked me is there was no integration, and people were, especially, they had that sort of hate. He's talking about the English here. And I think this is coming from this, I would not say British, I would call it English superiority, because they still live in the Victorian times. Now, what Mahmoud was trying to say there was, he made this point to me about this attitude that people have, that migrants have come to better themselves by being in the UK. And so they kind of get treated as if they should be grateful for being in exploitative work. But also what he wanted to kind of show on the other hand is that there's often a complacency when we think about the hostile environment in terms of Britain having a right to kind of take what it needs and extract what it needs from different workers, that has its kind of legacy and connections in colonialism. This is something that Kathryn, I think, will talk about a bit later too. It also plays out in a slightly different way. I'm going to come to an end very soon. In the political debates around the small boats and asylum seekers and hotels, which has been quite a pertinent thing across the country, and in Wisbech and in Peterborough and in parts of Lincolnshire like Skegness, in terms of hotels, like in Wisbech, the Rose and Crown, being taken over by private companies or by Serco, who kind of used to, kind of run them at a profit and charge the Home Office kind of bread and board for asylum seekers while they have their cases investigated. And the interesting thing that has kind of come up in these debates and discussions as they played out in Wisbech and elsewhere is this sense where people that I've interviewed kind of have the sense where there is anger about the small boats. It's a kind of wider question of being failed by the social contract and not being cared for. And I think that's another background consideration. So where does that leave us? Is kind of my initial effort to open up questions. I think so far in the work that I've been doing, there seems to be 3 different kinds of discourse around borders. There are moral arguments about borders, which are about what we owe to people internationally and what we owe to our own people. There are economic discourses about borders, which is what we get out of migrant workers, and maybe in turn, the economic opportunities by working in the UK. And then there are political discourses around borders, which are who we are. Are we a country that welcomes in others, maybe with connections to the Commonwealth or on grounds of ethnicity? Or are we, a country that, that cannot accommodate this anymore? Behind borders, as I'm kind of finding in the work in the Fens, is this a lot of different ideas about protection and obligation and solidarity, different ideas of how the social contract or fabric kind of protects and envelops or abandons. Also, what you get in Stories of Borders too are discussions around memory and family history and so on. So underlying, this is the last thing I'll say, underlying the complexities of the new regime now around settled status and exploitative labour and housing is this question that I'm really interested in of how hostile environments are produced. And I say hostile environments, because while I've been talking about migrant workers, this is also the conditions of workers being exploited, full stop. And the question really of in whose interests hostile environments really serve. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry that my slides worked, and hopefully I didn't freeze about 5 minutes ago and you're thinking, oh my God, when's he going to reconnect back on? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for presenting despite all the technical issues and sharing.
I'm sorry about them.
No problem at all. Thank you for sharing your research and really, really important points on and asking the questions that I think all of us can take with us of what we owe here and what we get and who we are as a country. I say that as an immigrant, but just reiterating your questions, and I think we can all reflect on that. And also particularly thank you for sharing the experiences and the interviews of the people that you have talked who have shared their own journeys of enduring these hostile environments, because behind all of these policies, there are real human beings who are enduring very, very difficult positions. And very important to raise this awareness. And I think Anita will go even deeper and even sharper towards these questions about experiences of human beings. Thank you, Anita.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I thought I'd start with 5 questions: who, where, when, why, and how. So, who are we? We're a charity. I've been the manager. The charity was set up in 2007, and I've been the manager here since 2008. I originally came for 3 years, but the job has been so challenging, it's kept me in post all of this time. But I truly thought I was coming into a relatively easy job, but the challenges have been absolutely unbelievable, and the things I've seen and heard also have been pretty big shock. Where are we? We're in Wisbech. Now we're strategically placed on the border of Lincolnshire, Norfolk and Cambridgeshire. So we're in Cambridgeshire, but if you go 5 miles that way, you're in Norfolk, and 5 miles that way, you're in Lincolnshire. So, and as we all know, that a lot of operational things like the constabulary, fire and rescue, they're all county based. So, and like the councils. So there's not a lot of crossover, even though so often when there's exploitation and people trafficking, it will go across borders. So they'll have maybe properties in Cambridgeshire, the work will be in Norfolk, and they're recruiting in Lincolnshire. So that it's never all in one county, which makes it much harder to actually find and identify. When were we set up? As I say, 2007. And the reason why and how, a coach load of people came from Poland. They paid their money for a job and accommodation, and they were dropped at the BP station in Wisbech in the middle of the night and left there. So they came to the Catholic Church. There was no job, no accommodation, no anything. They'd handed over their money. And a number of people, including the priest at the time, Father John Doman, they decided that they let the people sleep in church hall, arranged transport back to Poland. But that's where the idea came from, that there were people who were going to need support and who did need support. So from that, I mean, Wisbech, sorry, someone's going to answer that in a second. Sorry, I can't disconnect the phone in here, so it keeps going off. So yeah, so basically, Wisbech is a market town, and anybody will tell you, you know, if you come from a city, I come originally from London, but I've lived in Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire. Here, it's like taking a step back in time. People's maybe attitudes are different. It's a slower pace of life, cheaper property, rural, but there's not a huge amount to do. And the work-wise, we've got a whole layer missing. So you either have like chief execs or, you know, company, you know, managers, whatever, and they're often mostly recruited from outside the area. And then you've got a whole layer of like blue collar missing, and then you've got agricultural work, seasonal work. So it's very difficult for people to move. So mostly people will come in, they'll work in the fields, they then get a job in the factory, and then they look to progress. But there isn't that progression route in Wisbech, if that makes sense. Possibly, you know, Peterborough more so because it's a city. But what people want to do is they want to get out of the factories, they want to get into administration, into working in a bank, working in a school. And the other thing that they tend to do is they move out of Wisbech to the villages surrounding, because the villages are sort of more traditional, they're nicer, they haven't got as many HMOs. So going along with how unique we are here, there are lots and lots of HMOs. I mean, hundreds of HMOs with 3, 4, 5, 6 people living in. A lot of those are illegal HMOs, and we've heard people being exploited, paying, you know, mum, dad, 2 kids in one room, paying £1,000 a month for that room because they don't know any different. So as I say, underpinning everything we do, we offer lots of opportunities for people to mix, to integrate, but information, advice and guidance is the most important, because this is the only place that somebody can come to and get the help and support they need. The other unique thing about us is that the staff here reflect the local communities. So I have English, Lithuanian, Latvian, Romanian, Bulgarian, Ukrainian, Polish. So workers from all the different countries. So people are much more likely to engage, and they feel more comfortable when they come in and they can speak to somebody who speaks their language, same language. So lots of things we've had to deal with. Initially, when I first started, the biggest issues were gangmasters. Now, I don't know if anybody on here has I'd never heard the term. I've heard employment agencies, but I'd never heard the term labour provider or gangmaster. That was quite new to me, but that was quite common for this area. So the gangmaster would, traditionally, it would be students, or it could be travellers, gypsy travellers. They would come in, they would pick the strawberries, pick the apples, and then off they would go at the end of the season. So the problem we have in Wisbech is that the work here is still seasonal, but people don't have their own accommodation, and they're not students looking to work in the summer and go home. So it sort of built up a problem where people were wanted, going back to what Dan just said about good and bad, people were wanted when the flowers were ready to pick, strawberries were ready to pick, but in between the different seasons, they weren't wanted, but there was nowhere for them to go. And they had no income, no recourse to public funds, but they still had to pay rent on their property. So we ended up with people that were renting garages to sleep in, renting garden sheds at the end of people's gardens to sleep in. So, and lots of rough sleeping, so lots and lots of issues and problems. But again, like we say, hostile environment. So for me, the reason that the environment was hostile was because of the way people were being treated with regards to what they were being offered for work and what they were being offered for accommodation. We had, and just as an example, one family, solicitor family, had 70 plus properties that they were renting out, and that's sort of going back 10 years ago, with anything between 3 and 6 people in a room. The other issue is a lot of the property here around, especially around the centre, are like small terrace, rows of terrace houses. And if you put 6 or 8 people in one of those, when you've got an elderly couple next door and those people are on shift work, they come home at 6 in the morning, they want to sit and have a beer in the garden, so they're maybe making a little bit of noise. There's also, because there's so many of them in the house, producing more rubbish, so there are bags of rubbish outside. That then upsets the neighbours, which makes it even more hostile for those people, because now they can't mix socially. So in addition to having accommodation problems, employment problems, they've now got like social problems. People are reporting to the council and things like that. Then we started to find a lot going on with regards to modern day slavery and labour exploitation. So we were part of, the police ran something called Operation Pheasant. So we did some work with the police looking, so there were 2 very successful prosecutions on that. And that involved things like forced marriages. People were run into debt, then they were offered a small amount of money to marry somebody. And another one of them, she was told that she needed to sell one of her kidneys to pay back her debt. So there were an awful lot of pretty serious things going on. And then, and then from Operation Pheasant, there's still something called Task Pheasant that's running, but it's not quite so active. We got involved. We got the Secretary of State involved. We had Professor Gary Craig and Professor Margaret Greenfield on board. We got some reports done, and we held a big conference in London at Fens house to raise awareness around modern day slavery. Then more recently, we've been working with Flex, which is labour exploitation. So we interviewed 50 people, and we undertook, our part was to undertake 250 surveys. And so sort of jumping from one to the other. So migrant workers were the people who were being exploited, and in lots of cases still are. After Brexit, obviously, there's no new people coming in for the seasonal work. And so the seasonal worker scheme, the tier 5, more people coming in. Previously, they'd come in from Ukraine, but with the war in Ukraine, they were being recruited from Nepal, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan. It was a different ball game. One of the things we noticed some time back was also people who were going out recruiting, like gangmasters. They were actually targeting people who had an alcohol, a drug problem, or learning disability, because those people were much easier to exploit. So we were getting people coming in, they had like their own problems, but they were actually being exploited and recruited because they were, it was known that these people were going to be easier to exploit. We had people with their passports taken off them. That was a constant thing. So we worked with the GLAA, Gangmasters Licensing Association. We worked with Unite Union. So lots of different agencies, but what we found is no agency actually gives practical support. They're there to give advice, etc. But last year we had 7 people from Kazakhstan who had paid £3,000 to come. They'd had 2 weeks work picking apples in Gorefield, and then they were given a week's notice. They contacted the agency to ask, can we be transferred? And the agency was extremely unhelpful and just said basically, no, you need to find your own work. Well, the terms and conditions of the visa is they can only change work if it's done by the agent. So they were in a position they couldn't change the work. This was in October. Their flights were booked for February, so they couldn't get a change of flight. And they literally had nowhere to sleep. And they were in debt, with £3,000 debt. So they went to London to work on black labour or a construction site. Lots come out, and I think Dan's put the reports. There's 2 reports so far been produced by Flex, which is focused on labour exploitation, And I think Dan's put the links on the chat for me. But this one's, you know, for me, it's quite powerful. But it's not anything that I didn't know was already happening. And it's a lady from Kazakhstan. She's 32. She says, and these are her words, I can tell you that a lot of people in Kazakhstan have sold their belongings or their assets just to have enough money to come here, hoping that it would be better here and they could earn more money. Can you imagine? Sold everything they owned. There are some people who leave their jobs to come here because they are told it'd be better here. They see it on TikTok, Telegram, Instagram, videos, and everything looks perfect and beautiful. But once they arrive here, it's completely different. It's just an image and a deception. And I mean, I can back that up because when we were looking at doing these surveys, we used social media sites to contact people who we knew were coming. And I think Sergey, one of my employees, he was blocked from 5 of those in one day because he was looking to interview people. So very quickly we were kicked out. We're quite often kicked off of Facebook pages, things like that, because we ask too many questions. So yeah, so I don't know how I'm doing for time. Do I have a few more minutes?
We're still good, Anita. Please continue.
Are you sure?
Yeah, okay. A couple of minutes, 3 minutes or
Thank you.
Easy. Yeah.
So yeah, so I'm just sort of like looking at the notes I've made. Yeah, so we've been able to be quite creative. We've got rooms and halls that we can hire out, so we get some income, and we work with different, you know, authorities, public health. We've worked with Westminster and what have you. So we have a number of projects running, but you know what we tend to do is offer practical support. So it might be transport. There's been cases where we've had to pay for a bus for somebody to go back to Poland, for a flight to go back to Latvia, for people to go for their train fare to go to London, to the embassy to get a passport, replacement passport. And I know for a fact we're pretty unique, and there isn't anywhere probably in the east of England that does what we do. So what that flags up to me is, you know, there just isn't the support out there. People don't know where to go. What came through on these interviews we did with Flex was people don't know where to go. They don't know who to contact. If you're going to exploit somebody, you isolate them. That's the first thing you do. And people here are seasonal workers are isolated on farms. They're often given transport to a shop and then taken back again. I mean, we heard about one place that were charging if there was lots and lots of caravans, and there were 4 outside showers, so something like, you know, 30-40 caravans with 5-6 people in, 4 outdoor showers. Some of the caravans had showers, some didn't. None of them had hot water, it was cold water. They were transported from the caravan to a farm. If they wanted to stop at a shop on the way back to get food, they were charged £3 each person each time they stopped. So again, there was nothing in the rules or regulations to say that that couldn't be done. So those are the type of things that Flex are trying to change, if you like, government policy wise. So that's me done. Sorry. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Anita. This was fantastic and so important. And thank you so much for sharing and shedding the light on the labor exploitation and what you have mentioned, basically modern slavery that you're working with, and also how you have in the beginning raised the issues of not only the national borders, but also the importance of county borders and the consequences of these borders for the migrant workers and the most vulnerable people who are being exploited and targeted by predatory agencies. And yeah, thank you for shedding the light on these very important issues. Dr. Kathryn Medien, would you like to continue the discussion?
Yeah, hopefully you can all hear me. I'm going to share my screen with you all. How did I do that before? Here we go. Okay. Hopefully you can see it. Perfect. Yes. Thank you. Okay. So hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Anita and Dan for those really rich talks, and to Umut and Alison and Lisa for organising this research festival. It's really great to have the chance to talk to you all. My presentation is going to take a slightly different approach and focus more on the history of the hostile environment and why thinking historically about these policies is really important. But before I begin, I thought I would introduce you to some of my recent work that's engaged with the hostile environment in different ways and say a bit more about what my main focus is, which is really how these policies are being resisted. So over the past few years, some of my research has been examining internal border controls, by which I mean citizenship and residency checks designed to sort, exclude and govern within the nation state's borders rather than at ports of entry, an attempt to understand how these borders function, what their lineage is and how we might go about resisting them. As part of this research, I've documented the history and present of internal border controls within the NHS, and I recently spoke about that at the Politics and Literature seminar series that Dan co-organises. And I've worked with the Patients Not Passports campaign, who are doing really excellent work challenging the hostile environment within the NHS. And along with members of that campaign and the New Economics Foundation, I co-authored a comparative report looking at international healthcare struggles and looking at how different groups across Europe are resisting borders within healthcare. I've also spoken at campaign meetings and trainings, and my research has fed into campaign strategy, and I'll be talking about some of that research. The hostile environment within the NHS has untold impacts on migrants with insecure immigration status. I've conducted fieldwork with birth doulas and pregnant women who are faced with passport checks and charges for their healthcare. And I've also looked at the kinds of technologies that are employed to identify migrants with insecure immigration status. For example, data sharing agreements between various government departments and the Home Office. And in a chapter published in this book, The Entangled Legacies of Empire, I explore how one NHS trust in London was employing credit checks. Well, they were called credit footprint checks to try and identify migrants who weren't eligible for free NHS care. And so looking at the kind of ways that algorithms and technological strategies are being employed to try and target migrants. Theoretically, or in terms of framing, my research has situated internal border controls within the legacies of British colonialism and empire and asked how they operate within broader structures of racialised capitalism. Within this context, I'm interested in thinking speculatively about what a world without the kinds of fortified borders that we currently have might look like. And I'm part of a collective who've co-edited this book, Border Abolition Now, that contains contributions from activist groups and academics who are organising against border violence in different parts of the world. And I'm also part of and this book should be coming out in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think. I'm also part of a collective of migrant rights organisations and social justice groups who are experimenting with border abolition in practice and collaborating to put these kind of ideas into practice in different organisations. So I've given this background to try and help you situate my work. And in the Q&A, please ask me about anything that I've just mentioned if you're more interested in that. But I'm going to be talking about some research that I've conducted into what we might understand as an earlier iteration of what we today call the hostile environment. And by hostile environment, just to, I guess, repeat what Dan said, I'm referring to the set of policies that were announced by Theresa May in 2012 and that were brought into being by the 2016 and 2014 Immigration Acts, which have seen statutory border controls introduced in arenas of everyday life. Housing, domestic violence services, banks, employment, the NHS and elsewhere, and that have led to an array of data sharing processes between various government departments and the Home Office, and that have turned workers and the general public into agents of immigrant enforcement. So talk of our welfare state and entitlement to it often falls back into a nationalist frame. On the one hand, we see this through these kind of nativist claims that Britain's resources ought to be the sole preserve of the kind of British understood as white subjects, and on the other hand, through calls to remember and revitalise the principles of British post-war democracy and ideas of a universal welfare state. However, as scholars have recently argued, the founding and growth of Britain's welfare states was only made possible through the colonial extraction and appropriation of resources. And out of this frame, we sort of see categories of good and bad migrants, legal and... Sorry, could I just ask that whoever's speaking could just mute their mic, please? Thank you. Yeah, so out of this kind of history, we see these categories of good and bad migrants, legal and illegal migrants, and these are categories that ultimately I want to trouble. So in this short talk, I'll build on this work and I'll situate the hostile environment within an older British genealogy. I'm going to introduce the work of a group that I've been researching, the No Pass Laws Here group, and in exploring how they framed and documented the incursion of borders and racialised surveillance into everyday life in 1980s Britain, I suggest that they offer a way of comprehending internal border controls and welfare access that doesn't rely on nationalism, but instead helps us understand hostile borders as both a reconfiguration of empire and in relation to hostile regimes of control and surveillance elsewhere. And this presentation is based on archival research that I conducted at the Hull History Centre in Hull and the Institute of Race Relations in London. So just to provide a little bit of context, and you may already be familiar with this, so I'll keep it brief, but in 1981, the UK government passed the Nationality Act. The Act built on earlier immigration legislation, including the 1968 and 1971 Acts. And the 1981 Act really did, I guess, completely reimagine and kind of change what it meant to be British or who had access to the category British. It abolished the category citizenship of the UK's and colonies, which was the citizenship rights that former citizens of empire had. So that was how members of the Windrush generation came here and so many others. And it was replaced with a simple category, British citizen, which was tied to parental lineage. So as has been argued in defining citizenship through lines of descent to Britain, the Act began to legally cement the idea that to be British was to be white or of this island. Imogen Tyler, sociologist, has argued that the 1981 Nationality Act was designed to define, limit and remove the entitlements to citizenship from British nationals in the Commonwealth, the former colonies, thereby restricting immigration to the British Isles and creating aliens within the borders of the nation states. And so this is a really important moment in kind of the history of internal border controls in Britain, because if the British welfare state is for British citizens and citizenship is defined in a way that excludes racialised people, then checks need to be carried out to ensure that these so-called aliens or foreigners aren't accessing services that they're not entitled to. So in tandem with this act, a regime of passport controls and racial profiling was introduced across British public services and in collaboration with the police and the Home Office. And what this kind of does, what kind of tracing this history of immigration and nationality acts does is it reminds us that the categories of legal and illegal migration and legal and illegal migrants are not made, they're not given, they are not natural. And who is or who isn't entitled to citizenship in Britain is something that has shifted over time, and it's shifted in line with the British Empire. So following the Nationality Act, a number of campaigns arose in Britain to resist internal passport checks. These included, but were not limited to, the campaign against racist laws, the No Racist Checks campaign, which was based in Peckham. And they specifically campaigned against the introduction of passport checks within dole offices. And the group that I'll speak a bit more about now, No Pass Laws Here. So No Pass Laws Here emerged as a coalition between migrant organisations, welfare action groups, law centres and other community organisations. For example, they included the African Refugee Housing Action Group, the Oldham Law Centre, Greenwich Welfare Rights, Lambeth Welfare Rights, the Hillingdon Law Centre, Paddington Law Centre, among many others. And together they sought to both document and challenge the increasing internal activities of the Immigration Service and the growing array of policies and formal and informal procedures that required racialised people living in Britain to show their passports in order to receive welfare services and access employment. At their inception in 1981, following the Nationality Act, they produced a leaflet, which you can see a copy of now, and which I'm going to read a little bit from, just to give you an idea of what they were all about. So No Pass Laws Here is the slogan of a campaign being mounted by several organisations. We want to demonstrate and expose the extent of internal immigration control. We want to campaign against the introduction of new controls and for the abolition of existing controls. Internal immigration controls are spreading throughout national and local agencies of the state. More and more central and local government departments are becoming immigration watchdogs for the Home Office. The No Pass Laws Here group has been collecting instances of the increasing amount of surveillance, control and harassment of immigrant and Black residents in Britain. Passport raids at workplace and homes, passport inspections for jobs, local authority housing, health treatment, education and bank accounts, extensive questioning by registrars of marriage, when applying for social security assistance, when requesting police assistance, if convicted of offences, and in seeking to satisfy provision of the recent Nationality Act 1981. So if you're familiar with today's hostile environment policies, what I've just read will probably sound strikingly familiar. In seeking to challenge and ultimately abolish internal border controls, the No Pass Laws Here group produced regular bulletins and newsletters that documented cases of internal borders in education, housing, social security, healthcare workplaces and banks. And they also produced and translated information leaflets about policy changes. They held workshops and conferences, and through law centres supported legal challenges to individual cases. They also publicised protests, days of action, and supported individual anti-deportation campaigns. Taking their name from the pass law system of apartheid South Africa, throughout their work, they did a number of things that I think are really important. They pointed to the increase in data sharing between government departments and the Home Office, as well as the police and the Home Office. They argued that internal borders sought to undermine the rights of all racialised people in the UK because anyone who looked or sounded foreign was liable for questioning. They highlighted the specific ways that migrant women were subjectified by the border regime through, for example, being responsible for care and reproductive labour, which then often placed them at the front line. They would be the ones in doctors' waiting rooms, in A&E, and in other benefit offices. They called out unions that collaborated with immigration enforcement. And importantly, they drew attention to the ways in which border controls within the welfare state were the direct result of state racism. They created a colour bar through the working class, they divided workers, and they created categories of deserving and undeserving benefit recipients. So before I go into their work in a bit more detail, I'm going to touch a bit more on their framing. So as I said, No Pass Laws Here took their name from the pass law system of apartheid South Africa, a system that required black workers to carry passes with them at all times in order to access work and land, and which ultimately sought to maintain racial segregation and dispossession within a white supremacist state, while also securing the provision of cheap black labour. In short, pass laws secured a system of racialised capitalism. Understanding internal passport controls here as not identical to, but as operating within the same colonial and racist logics of the apartheid pass law system, this group draw links between internal regimes of control here and those elsewhere. And this is a really important framing in the context of the Nationality Act, because if we understand internal border controls to be part of a larger state project that is functioning to strip citizenship and rights from formerly colonised populations, and as a way to put borders in place to stop those people from accessing the welfare state, which was historically funded from the wealth derived from colonialism, then anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism become really important frameworks within which to resist internal border controls in post-colonial Britain. And I would actually say that remains a crucial framing, and that's part of the work, the strategy work that I've been doing with some campaigns, is to sort of ask how we think about resistance to internal borders without appeals to kind of a nationalist state. And I would also suggest that the use of this framing allows us to draw out the material connections between restrictive technologies of governance globally, and it really underscores the vital relationship between migration and border regimes, particularly in their role in the perpetuation of racialised capitalism. So in this sense, rather than a relic of a past apartheid system, they kind of came to understand pass laws as a racist, segregationist technology that shaped the colonial metropole and whose logics might persist today. And I think this is really important in this present moment. There's been a lot of work on the kind of afterlives of the apartheid system, and particularly of the pass law system. There's a really great book that looks at how pass laws essentially inspired the guest worker visa system, which the US, Canada, states across Europe have long used in order to admit and expel guest workers. There's also a great book that looks at the links between the pass law system and the permit regime that the state of Israel uses to manage and restrict freedom of movement for Palestinians in the occupied territories. So I think it's a really interesting framing. So they use this frame and they sought to challenge internal border controls. And one way they did this was disseminating bulletins, which included articles detailing various changes in welfare rules, individual cases and information about passport raids. This is their March 1982 bulletin, for example, and here they explored how social security and inland revenue were now requesting proof of immigration status, leading to increasing instances of refusal of benefits for migrants. And they argued that government policy and legislation, I'm quoting them, has created an atmosphere where suspicion of and hostility to non-white people as citizens, as claimants, is legitimate. The passport is the only means of checking up on the would-be claimant's immigration status, and foreign-looking or sounding applicants are the only ones for whom this question arises. And on these bulletins were sort of 4 to 6 pages long. And this one also included details of immigration raids in workplaces, and it noted that Nottingham City Council had issued schools with a directive to check pupils' passports. Their April 1983 bulletin raised concerns about the increasing role of computers in facilitating data sharing between police, immigration services and welfare departments. And really what they write about kind of algorithms and kind of data sharing, even though it was pretty a lot more basic systems at the time, really rings true today. Alongside their bulletins, they also created information leaflets targeted at different areas of welfare and at different migrant populations, providing like know your rights style advice. And these were often translated into different languages. So why am I sharing all of this, and what do I think it might offer us today? Well, besides offering us an expansive archive of the history of internal borders in Britain, as well as an archive of the kind of resistance and to internal borders, and kind of forming part of this longer history of abolition, which is often thought to be a US framework, it isn't. It offers us a case history, which helps us make sense of how populations have been sorted, differentially targeted by racist and racialising state apparatus. And looking back from today's hostile environment, it demonstrates the endurance of these kind of internal passport controls over time. The hostile environment is very often referred to as something new. And that's also in some of the academic scholarship as well, that kind of this kind of Theresa May ushers in this shift from checking borders at ports of entries to controls internal within Britain. And, you know, as you can see, that's really not the case. A key difference today is that many of the regulations that I've just talked you through were not statutory duties. The hostile environment is a statutory duty, and that means that they were often applied unevenly, particularly uneven in a geographical sense. But I nonetheless think there may be a few things that we can take from this archive, particularly this group's anti-nationalism, their refusal to romanticise the welfare state, even as they wanted to make claims of it, and the connections that they drew between police brutality and pass laws. And I haven't actually really spoken about that, but there's some really great links that this group drew between kind of immigration enforcement and the police, and their understanding that internal passport controls functioned to divide workers, which is also something that I think Dan spoke about. I'm going to leave it there and stop sharing,